Thank you, Melissa, and I'm not quite sure what to do with that piece of advice. It was inconceivable that I'd ever grow up. But can I acknowledge certainly the Minister, other dignitaries here today, Ngāti Whātua o Ōrākei, and your leadership role in Auckland, and the many others. It's my pleasure to speak on behalf of the Resource Management Review Panel. I'm glad they've got the right title up there, because in the brochure they said I was an RMA specialist, which I'm not. So I want to be very clear on that. But congratulations to Infracom for putting on today, and it's a real pleasure just to give you an update. Can also pass on the congratulations of the Construction Accord, John, because we see a strong link between what you're trying to achieve and the construction sector. So if I can acknowledge that, please take that with you. I want to cover off today, just in a very few minutes, what the role of the Resource Management Panel is and who's on it. I want to talk a little bit about the submissions that we've received, and I want to share with you some of our current thinking. Maybe you feel a bit more informed about the hard work we have been doing. Look, as many of you are aware, the current government has commissioned an overhaul of the resource management system. And keep in mind, that's just not about the RMA. That's also about Local Government Act. It's about the Land Transport Management Act and the many other pieces of legislation this needs to work with. It's about how we manage our resources across the system in New Zealand. On that panel with me is Amelia Lindsay. I can see Amelia over there. We have Rachel Brooking. We have Raewyn Peart, Kevin Prime, and it's chaired by Tony Randerson, a former president, recently retired, of the Court of Appeal. So, what is it? The review of the resource management system is about future state. It's not about current state. It acknowledges current state, but it's about future state. So when I talk about that, what I am saying is that we've got many other pieces of legislation that are either in place or emerging, and the transition from current and those emerging pieces of legislation, the future state will be dealt with differently. We've stepped to the future and said, what does New Zealand need from a resource management system, a comprehensive review? Okay, that's our position. It's quite clear from the terms of reference that we are to address both natural environment quality, but also the built environment. Okay, so we hold those two together. We're quite clear in our terms of reference that we are to acknowledge and look at how we address with improving environmental outcomes, because we are seeing a deterioration. How do we handle urban growth? How do we handle infrastructure development across New Zealand? How do we handle the pressures of climate change? So we've got all those in mind, and we're looking at the resource management system as a system. We're also very interested in our treaty obligations and how we take those principles and how we take those obligations and how we weave them into the resource management system. We're also quite clear that it's time for change. With some 40,000 applications, many of them non-notified, with a deteriorating environment, with the challenges of growth, we're clear on the need for change. So, what's some of the feedback that you've been giving us? I'm going to give a quick snapshot of that, and I'll talk about our current thinking. Some of the key themes. The majorities of submitters oppose separate legislation. So there's been quite a discussion around whether you have a Development Act and Environment Act. The majority of submitters don't agree with that. They want to see integration. Strong support for clear objectives around the built natural environment within that single act, and better alignment between that act, the Resource Management Act, and other legislation. A more strategic focus for housing and infrastructure. And this is where there's a real role and an overlap in thinking between what we're considering on the RM panel and what the Infracom's looking to lead. Spatial planning, and I'll talk about that a bit more, but definitely supported. An overwhelming number of submitters think that greater funding for tangata whenua is required if they're going to play a meaningful role, not just at the consent end, but on the way through in terms of governance and strategic decision making. We will complete our review and we'll submit that to government by the end of May. So we've got a lot of work to do on this, trust me. This has certainly been a very demanding but very interesting exercise. The government will then consider that through Cabinet, and then our report will be made publicly available. So, what's the panel thinking? I want to touch on 4 or 5 key points. First one, spatial planning. We're currently thinking that there should be separate legislation that sits across and integrates with the other pieces of legislation. We see limitations of embedding that requirement in any one existing piece of legislation. We see it as being likely to be mandatory. We see spatial planning being very future focused, 30 to 50 years, and it's not just about urban growth. It's about how we protect important environmental areas. We've had significant discussions about Mackenzie Basin or some of our harbours, the Kaipara, the Hauraki. We see a significant reduction in size in the RMA too. It's doubled. I can't even keep track of the amendments to it, and I'm not sure how a planner does. I'm sure the lawyers do a really good job of it. But we do see a significant reduction in its size. We have done a lot of thinking about Part 2. This sets the whole tone for that piece of legislation. And I've touched on a number of those. But you'll see strength and protection of Indigenous biodiversity and the health of ecosystems. You'll see us thinking about how we draw in our treaty obligations. So there's been some really good work done around Te Mana o Te Wai or Te Mana o Te Taio. How do we bring those principles in, and how do they reflect through in the legislation? You'll see a shift from talking about effects-based, deficit-based thinking into outcomes. Okay, so we will describe outcomes. We will look for that to be taken through the planning system. We'll talk about bottom lines and limits, and I'm being told to hurry up. And we'll talk about targets and how you drive towards progressive improvement. You'll see us try and embed in greater agility and responsiveness to our changing world. And I'll talk about changing world in terms of climate, but growth and environmental outcomes. And simplified consenting and approvals processes. A lot of work to be done. It's thoroughly enjoyable, great team, and I look forward to being on the panel. Thank you. Thanks.